Hey guys, welcome back to another video, and in this session we are going to be focusing on drawing linear functions. And it is actually a direct follow-up video from a previous video that I made called Solving Linear Equations. And in that video we focused on this first part, namely the algebraic approach, where we had to find x. Now in this part we'll be focusing on the graphical approach, which has more to do with functions. The link to the previous video I will put somewhere in the description or somewhere in this video, because at some point we'll be needing the things that you've learned over there in this video. As always, in these videos I will be focusing on the exercise part of the mathematics, because this will give you some hands-on experience and it will give you some more practice. So before we go on, I also want to mention that if you like this video, which means if you've actually learned something, don't hesitate to give it a like, because in this way, people that are also looking for more explanatory videos are more probable of finding this video. So with that out of the way, let's look at a first example of how these exercises will be. The first example is f of x is equal to 2x plus 1. So even though I will not address the theory in this video, let's just recap what this actually means. This f of x, what does it mean? Well, we have an input, which is x, which is any number you like. And this x gets into this function, f. And what this function does, in this case, it multiplies x by 2 and then adds 1. And this will give us an output. Just a number, another number. So this f of x, this function, basically takes x and puts it into another number, which is here. Let's take, for instance, x is equal to 1. Then we have x of 1, which is equal to 2 times 1 plus 1, which is equal to 3. Let's, for instance, take minus 1, because we're in no means limited to only positive numbers. So minus 1, we get f of minus 1, which is equal to 2 times minus 1 plus 1, which is equal to minus 2 plus 1. So it's minus 1. And well, the list goes on and on. You can, for any number that you can imagine, we have our function and it outputs any other number. So the question now is how to represent this graphically. Graphically means we have two axes, and on the horizontal axis we'll put our input. So this is our input. And on the vertical axis we get our output, which is here, output. So for any x that we give as input, we will get an output over here. How do we now find graphically the line that connects these 2 points? For example, take x is 1, which is here. We know that it will give f of x is equal to 3, which is at this point. So we track this one vertically until we get to the point 3. And at this point, we will put a dot, because this dot connects 3 and 1. The same can be done for minus 1, which is here. It's minus 1. And we know that minus 1 gives minus 1, which is here, this point. So again, we track minus 1 down until we reach the minus 1 on the output, and we give it a dot. Now these 2 dots, they will connect a line. What this line now means is that for any x input, I don't really need to calculate this entire function to get an output. No, we can just follow the input, any input really. For example, let's say here, which is like roughly 2.5. If we follow this input vertically until we cross the line, and then we track it horizontally to see what the output would be, then we get our output. So this line basically allows us to graphically represent the relation between the input, which was here, which is x, and the output, which is here. The question in these exercises is now, find the correct line given f of x is, well, whatever the exercise is given. Now, like I said, a line is determined by 2 points. So basically, to get the line, we need 2 points. So let's draw our graphs again. Here is our input and here is our output. So we need 2 points. Let's say that the first point is where the line crosses the vertical axis. So where is this? Well, this is exactly where x is equal to 0. This means that our first point will come from f of 0. The second point that we want to, well, use to draw our line is where that our line crosses the horizontal axis. And this is our second point, is where f of x is equal to 0. Let's take any random line now. So let's say that this is our f of x now. So at this point, our f of x is equal to 0, right? Because if we track this point horizontally, we get to 0. Likewise, this point is the function where x is equal to 0. So these are our 2 points that we need to find. F of 0 and where f is equal to 0. And this part, this second point, this is exactly the previous video. Here we need the algebraic approach to linear equations. And this I discussed in detail in the previous video. And even so that all of the exercises that we did in the previous video, I will now use as example exercises for this video. So if at any point you're not sure how I get the results for the second point, you can always go to the previous video and see how I got them step by step. So let's now look how this general approach applies in concrete exercises. The first one being f of x is equal to x plus 3. Now, as we've seen before, we need 2 points in order to draw our graph or to draw our line. And the first point, which was where does our line cross the vertical axis, which is where does our line cross the x equal 0 axis. So what we need to find here is f where x is equal to 0. Or in shorthand notation, f of 0, which is 0 plus 3, which is equal to 0. And this 0 here comes from x being 0, of course. So we've got our first point, which is f of 0 is equal to 3. The second point is where our line will cross the horizontal axis, which is, as we've seen, where f of x is equal to 0. And this is the point where the previous video will come in handy, because what we need to do here is solve the equation x plus 3 is equal to 0. And this is exactly the type of equations that we solved in the previous video, step by step. In this case, x will be equal to minus 3. And again, if this is not entirely clear, I recommend watching the previous video where I go through exactly these exercises to make it all much more smooth and go through them step by step. So we got our second point. Let's now translate our findings onto the graph with x on the horizontal axis and f of x on the vertical axis. Now again, where does our line cross the vertical axis? Well, this is at 3. So 1, 2, 3, that's here. So at x equals 0, we've got that fx is equal to 3. So now for the second point, let's see where our line crosses the horizontal axis, which is what we found here at x is equal minus 3. So minus 1, minus 2, minus 3. That's over here. So now simply connect these two dots and we have our function f of x. So that's the basic approach to these exercises. Let's now go to the next exercise, which has f of x is equal to 3x plus 3. Again, we need 2 points, and our first point is, well, quite easy. So it's f of x is equal to 0, which is equal to 3 times 0 plus 3 is again equal to 3. So that's our first point. Let's now look at the second point, which is where f of x is equal to 0. So this means that we have to solve the linear equation of 3x plus 3 is equal to 0. And again, you can watch the previous video, but if we just, in short, subtract 3 from both sides of the equation and then divide by 3, we get that x is equal to minus 1. And this is our second point that we have. So let's now see how we transfer these findings onto the graph. We have x on the horizontal axis, f of x on the vertical axis. So where does our line cross the vertical axis? Well, we found that at x equals 0, which is the vertical axis, at 3. So 1, 2, 3, which is right here. Where does our line cross the horizontal axis? Well, that is where f of x is equal to 0. So this is at minus 1. That would be here at minus 1. We connect the two dots and we have our function f of x, which goes through 3 and minus 1. And if we compare now with the previous graph, which crossed at minus 3 and 3, we see that this graph is much steeper, which will be, well, related to this factor in front of the x, which determines the slope of the curve, of the straight line. So let's now look at the next exercise, which is f of x is equal to 5 times x minus 8. Again, our first point is where x is equal to 0, which in this case is 5 times 0 minus 8, which is equal to minus 8. And we already have our first point where our line that we need to find crosses the vertical axis. Our second point is where f of x is equal to 0, which means we have to solve the linear equation 5x minus 8 is equal to 0. And in the previous video, I went through this step by step, and we find that x is equal to 8 divided by 5. And we again have our second point. Let's again transfer this to our nice graph, which x on the horizontal axis and f of x on the vertical axis. So where does our line cross the vertical axis? Well, that's just at this point where x is equal to 0, we have minus 8. So we have minus 1, minus 2, minus 3, minus 4, minus 5, 6, 7, 8. So that's a bit unfortunate, but well, you get the point at minus 8. And where will our line cross the horizontal axis? Well, that's just where f of x is equal to 0. So this will be at 8 divided by 5, which is around here. So it's 8 divided by 5. Again, we connect our 2 points and we have the straight line that we wanted to find. Quite straightforward, right? Let's now look at the next exercise, which is f of x is equal to 3x minus 12. Again, the first point is very straightforward, which is just f of x is equal to 0, which is basically 3 times 0, because x is 0, minus 12 is equal to minus 12. The second point is where f of x is equal to 0, for which we have to solve the linear equation 3x minus 12 is equal to 0. and we get that x is equal to 1 over 4. So again, let's see how this translates onto our graphs. And I draw them in this very funny fashion because I already know that this minus 12 will be where the function, or well, our line will cross this axis. So I will have to draw it very much below. So let's say that this first point is here, so that's minus 12. And the second point is where it crosses the horizontal axis, which is 1/4. So we see that this function is a very steep function that crosses both points. And again, we have our result. So let's now step it up a notch and go to the next exercise. This one will look a bit different. So it's x minus 7 is equal to 3x. This does not look like the form of f of x is equal to something. So we first have to get all of the x's to one side of the equation and all of the numbers as well. What we first have to do here is to get this 3x to the other side of the equation. And again, that's something I do in detail in the previous video. What this means is that we get x minus 7 minus 3x, because we subtract 3x from both sides of the equation to get rid of this 3x. So this simply becomes minus 2x minus 7 is equal to 0. And now we have our function, which is f of x is equal to minus 2x minus 7. And now we can do again the same as we did before. Our first point is where x is equal to 0, which is just equal to minus 2 times 0 minus 7, which is minus 7. The second point is where f of x is equal to 0, for which we need to, well, solve the linear equation. Minus 2x minus 7 is equal to 0. Or minus 2x is equal to 7, because I add 7 to both sides of the equation. Or this is equal to x is equal to minus 7 divided by 2. So there we have our second point. Let's now again look how this looks like on a graph with x and f of x. So where does our line cross the vertical axis? Well, this is simply our first point, which is minus 7. Now, where does our line, our function, cross the horizontal axis? Well, this is simply our second point, where f of x is equal to 0, which is minus 7 over 2. And we see here that our line is now fundamentally different. It goes down, the slope is negative. And this can be attributed to the fact that in our function, there is a negative coefficient in front of the x. But that's more theory, so I will leave that to other sources here on YouTube, or I will make a theory video in the future if there is much demand for it. So let's conclude with the last exercise, which is 3/2 times x minus 5 is equal to x. And this is the most difficult that you will find them. So if you understand this exercise, and if you could do it yourself, you can basically do all of the exercises. So the first step again is to get this into the form of fx is equal to something, which means getting everything on one side of the equality sign. And here, this is done straightforwardly by just getting this x and getting it on the other side of the equality sign. So we get 3/2 x minus 5 is equal to 0. Or if we get this 3/2 minus, well, 2/2, which because 1 is 2 over 2, we get 1/2 x minus 5 is equal to 0. So we have our function f of x is equal to 1/2 x minus 5. And now actually the most difficult part is already done, and we can go to our basic algorithm. So the first point where x is equal to 0, this is the most easy point, which is just equal to 1/2 times 0, because x is 0, minus 5 is equal to minus 5, and we already have our first point. The second point is where f of x is equal to 0, for which we have to solve the linear equation 1/2 x minus 5 is equal to 0. So if we add 5 to both sides of the equation, then we get this one. And again, I go step by step through these exercises in the previous video. And then multiply both sides by 2, which we get x is equal to 10. And we have our second point. So for one last time, let's draw our graph. X on the horizontal axis, f of x on the vertical axis, and look at where does the line that we seek cross the vertical line, which is basically where x is equal to 0. And we found that to be minus 5. Where does our line cross the horizontal axis? That again is easily found by our second point, which is x is equal to 10. And then we just connect these 2 points to get our final result. So this concludes our video. I hope that you learned something. I hope that you weren't confused at any point in time. If you've got any remarks or any questions, please let me know in the comments. I can read all of the comments and reply to all of them. As always, thanks for watching. Again, if you like this video, please give it a like so that other people are more probable in finding this. And if you're looking forward to learning more, you can always subscribe to the channel because I will be trying to upload as many videos as I can. I hope you learned something and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.